Well, in view of the time, I'll not bother to summarise what Stuart's argument is, or rather, what I should more accurately say, the way his arguments have been taken to be. So I'll cut my remarks down to an absolute minimum, I think, in order to maintain the schedule. And also because what I really want to do is simply to raise some issues, which, as I said, have been raised by various people, largely on the basis of what Stuart's arguments have been taken to be, rather than what he actually says in the book. I was very interested to discover this morning, for example, that the title of his book is publisher's title, which I rather suspected all along, but now he's been kind enough to confirm it. Let me begin by asking the question: how should Stuart Nicholson's arguments be evaluated now, especially that we're well into the 21st century? First, it's essential to acknowledge that Stuart himself has demonstrated a deep involvement in and respect for what has come to be called the jazz tradition, as his books on Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald, among others, clearly demonstrate. Indeed, he's done more than most to celebrate the achievements of the musicians who are in the tradition. Further, it seems to me that Stuart's arguments may serve to place the issues faced by jazz in the context of more general cultural problems. One way of looking at this is to suggest that what Stuart has done is to examine some of the ways in which jazz musicians have confronted the challenge of postmodernism. After all, what we have come to call modern jazz is now well into its 7th decade. It can no longer be thought of as new music. And, as in the other arts, jazz has come to face the problem of what to do once modernism has run its course, once it has been revealed as a style like others, rather than a definition of how things should be. In this respect, I'm completely in agreement with Stuart Nicholson that to regard post-Parker bebop and its derivatives as the only way to play jazz is a serious mistake, albeit one made by many jazz educators. Cynics and many musicians, these categories often overlap, have often asked how well Pee Wee Russell or Lester Young or Thelonious Monk would do if faced by the sight reading tests, which are often part of the normal entry procedure in music colleges and university departments of music. The basic point here is that the crisis facing jazz is in many ways similar to that confronted in other art forms, and the responses to it are remarkably similar. One is a return to the classical values, another is the incorporation of elements from previously separate traditions, a third involves experiments with new technology, a fourth attempts to create an eclectic mix of styles, and so on. However, those of an academic, or perhaps I should say pedantic disposition, would be quick to point out that while Stuart is critical of the Marsalis, Crouch, Murray orthodoxy for its essentialist definition of jazz, he seeks to replace it with another which I would suggest is also essentialist. The music is a hybrid. Stuart's own words on this point are, jazz is a mongrel, which is also dynamic and refreshed by constant innovation. Indeed, it is tempting to see Stuart Nicholson's view of jazz as an exact opposite of what is espoused by Marsalis et al., although this may be pushing things too far. What I think is less contentious is the idea that Stuart's analysis tends to simplify a rather complicated situation. You don't have to spend much time in New York to realise the tremendous variety of ways in which jazz is played. It's not the case that innovations only occur outside the USA. Of course, it's true that most of these innovations are ignored by major record companies, but hasn't this always been the case? And couldn't the situation be much improved by the advent of the internet, as we've heard this morning? In this context, it's appropriate to say a little bit about jazz in Europe, and I'm very sorry that Manfred Eicher isn't here to give us his views on this particular topic. It's an important part of Stuart Nicholson's argument that, as it has spread around the world, jazz has absorbed something of other musical cultures. It's no longer exclusively American or indeed African American. I've always thought that until quite recently, non-American jazz musicians faced an impossible situation. If they sounded like Americans, they were regarded as derivative. And if they didn't sound like Americans, they were treated as not being authentic. So, get around that one. This is one of the comments that Stuart Nicholson makes. Throughout Europe, indeed throughout the world, jazz is being reimagined through the process of transculturation. And much of this has been documented for more than 40 years now on the ECM label based in Munich. In fact, one historian of the music described ECM as the first major jazz label to rely heavily on non-US talent. That's Ted Joyer. It's not surprising then that ECM recordings have come to be regarded as capturing a distinctly European aesthetic, reflected most obviously in what has come to be known as the ECM sound, but also in an evident commitment to the values of art rather than the values of the market. Yet, I'm suggesting now that it's possible to exaggerate the Europeanness of ECM. For one thing, many of the label's greatest successes have involved American musicians, such as Chick Corea, Guy Burton, Pat Metheny, Jack DeJohnette, and most notably, Keith Jarrett. Similarly, the notion of a distinct ECM sound is something of a myth. As a sociologist, or any sociologist will tell you, myths are not necessarily untrue. But the ECM sound does seem to me to be something of a myth. It's true, of course, that there are examples of calm, serious, indeed cerebral music, beautifully recorded. The painstaking piano explorations of the Canadian Paul Bley come to mind in this context. But in contrast to these, there are also some very different sounds. Jarrett's Standards Trio, for example, or the Art Ensemble of Chicago in full cry. So it may be argued that rather than self-consciously displaying a set of distinctly European musical values, what we can hear on ECM recordings are various efforts to blend improvisation with other musical genres, which include classical, as in Jarrett's case, or free music, or rock, or world music, or what Stuart Nicholson calls the Nordic tongue of Scandinavian traditions. It is instructive, too, to reflect that American musicians who have appeared on ECM recordings have in various ways sought to break away from or go beyond what has become known as the jazz tradition as it was developed in the USA from the 1920s to the 1960s. All this, I think, is consistent with Stuart Nicholson's general argument. The spread of jazz around the world has led to interesting encounters with all sorts of locally established musical traditions. At the same time, it would be a mistake to conclude that the American jazz tradition is aesthetically exhausted. As the European classical music tradition shows, music of the past is not necessarily invalid artistically, even when remote from the time and place of its origin. Moreover, it would be equally wrong to denigrate conventional jazz improvisation over a chord sequence. To do this convincingly requires a great deal of practice and study, and musical skills of a high order. And in this context, I would refer you to Paul Berliner's wonderful book, Thinking in Jazz. In fact, few succeed at this, that's improvisation over a chord sequence, and many fine musicians are not improvisers. It may be true, as Stuart Nicholson suggests, that jazz is no longer what Whitney Balliet famously called the sound of surprise. But if we're honest, it hasn't been like this for some time now. As I said earlier, modern jazz is now quite old, and as a result, it has lost much of its power to shock and surprise. What's more, to the constant frustration of musicians, audiences, even jazz audiences, although they hate to admit it, are often most comfortable with familiar sounds. Just as there is a role for challenge, innovation, and experimentation, there is also a place for the reassurance provided by the expected and the familiar. And in this context, I'm reminded of a gig I played on recently where I think the average age of the people in the room was about 68. And that was just a band. It was mentioned yesterday that, that there is a problem with the aging of the audience, and it's one that I think we need to think very seriously about. Reflections such as these may lead us to question Stuart Nicholson's contention that the culture of jazz is based on change. Unquestionably, the pace of change in the development of jazz in America was very rapid. Little more than 30 years separates the arrival of Louis Armstrong as a major soloist from the emergence of Ornette Coleman. But the very speed of this process itself raises interesting questions. Are change and innovation essential to jazz as a musical form? And, given the rapidity of jazz's development, could there not be scope for the further exploration of musical styles which rose and fell rather quickly, especially in the postmodern era? Some of this is already beginning to happen. It may be more useful to see it as, in part, a response to the very crisis that Stewart himself identifies, rather than be concerned just to condemn it as retro. It is also of some significance that there are elements of continuity as well as change in the work of many recent innovators. The Esborn and Svensson trio, for example, became, in Stewart's words, something of a supergroup, while retaining the piano, bass, drums, instrumentation, which is familiar from conventional American jazz. As I have said, Stuart Nicholson's book is immensely stimulating, thought-provoking, and raising many important issues concerning the nature and development of jazz as a music. In the present context, and given the time available, I think it's just important to concentrate on two more of these. First of all, there is the growth of jazz education in formal educational institutions. And a good deal has been said about this in the last couple of days, so I won't elaborate on this. Let me just make one point about this. It seems to me that Stewart rather weakens his argument by quoting in the book from jazz educators themselves, primarily concerned to push students into the old-fashioned American tradition of playing jazz. On the contrary, there are people like Tony Whiten in England or Walter Turkenberg in Denmark who are extremely concerned with moving students beyond that and allowing them to express themselves. So I would suggest here, and I'd be interested in Stuart's response to this, that he sort of weakens his own arguments by, in the book, quoting from jazz educators themselves. Finally, and this is the second of the main points I want to raise, I want to say something about an issue which is raised by Stuart's argument, which takes us far beyond the specifics of his book. As part of his examination of the ways in which jazz has been reshaped by its encounters with different musical traditions around the world, Stuart Nicholson places considerable emphasis on what he calls the Nordic tone. This musical style, we are told, has its roots in the existentially open, angst-ridden aspects of Scandinavian culture of the past century, and is of considerable significance. As he puts it, it is Scandinavian musicians who now seem to be at the forefront of the global jazz explosion. This view is consistent with Stewart's quite explicit acceptance of the proposition that music reflects the cultural conditions of its production. Thus, and these are his words, Louis Armstrong's music reflected New Orleans, or Duke Ellington's music, Harlem. Nicholson follows this up by writing, correctly I think, of the way in which British jazz musicians tended to follow American styles up to the 1960s, when some of them began to go their own ways. But this is where it seems to me the problems begin. In what ways do these divergent musical paths reflect British culture? And how does the culture get into the music? And what is British culture anyway? At first sight, it might seem that the notion of musical style reflecting the wider cultural configuration would be attractive to those such as me, who see the issue from a sociological point of view. However, as the questions above suggest, a little reflection shows the idea to be rather problematic. Most generally, it depends on the reification of the concept of culture, so that it is assumed to be some sort of homogeneous entity, and often to that of society, which is frequently taken to be identical with the nation state. Perhaps the most famous instance of music being seen to be somehow encode fundamental features of the wider culture occurs, in Adorno's accounts of the ways in which the works of European composers represent the rise and decay of bourgeois individualism. But, as musicologists have often asked, does this not mean denying, ultimately, the creativity of particular composers who are reduced to mere conduits for the transmission of cultural messages? And how precisely do social elements get into the music? I think that it's fair to suggest that, despite its importance in his theoretical skill, Adorno himself never explained this linkage satisfactorily. Indeed, Rose Subotnick, one of the foremost Adorno scholars of recent years, concluded that his account of the process was indirect, complex, unconscious, undocumented, and rather mysterious. Other commentators have been no less perplexed. As Raymond Williams put it when writing of Marx, it's one thing to demonstrate the social and historical conditions which are obtained when an artwork is produced, but it's quite another to show how the former gets into the latter. Let me try and put this matter in a less abstract way, and to return to Stuart Nicholson's argument. He has asserted that there is a Nordic tone which is discernible in the work of Scandinavian musicians. But is there a general culture of Scandinavia? Of course there are similarities among people, but there are also important differences. I know, for example, that there are tensions. There is a certain amount of history between Norwegians and Swedes. I will say no more about this. On a previous visit to Norway, I was told that there is a difference between the agricultural interests in the north of the country and the commercial interests in the south of the country. And these can be consequential. This, it was argued to me, has resulted in Norway not becoming a member of the European Union. Now, this is a significant difference. Now, again, I'll say no more about this, because there are lots of people here who know a great deal more about the issue than I do. All I want to suggest is that just as there are similarities among people, so there are differences, different points of view, different interests, and so on. And in this context, may I also say, I think there is something of an inconsistency in demanding, on the one hand, that musicians be original and creative and display their individuality in their music, and on the other hand, expecting them to reflect or represent a tradition or a culture. Now, how can you do this? You can't. It seems to me inconsistent to ask them to do both things. Again, let me put it more concretely. It's true that Sweden produced the Esbjörn Svensson trio, but how precisely did their music reflect elements of Swedish culture? Sweden has also produced ABBA and the Gothenburg Symphony Orchestra. As these are these other ways of playing music to be dismissed as not being authentic? I suggest that what we're seeing here are different musical styles which have evolved in what the sociologist Howard Becker has called distinctive art worlds. These simply cannot be mapped onto particular societies, let alone the neat boundaries of nation states. In general, and here I'm in complete agreement with Stuart, what has been happening over the last 50 years or so is the gradual emancipation of European and other jazz musicians, both from the stylistic hegemony of America and from the dictates of self-conscious modernism. Years ago, the great bassist and composer Charles Mingus, in a source in which you might be able to help me here, I've never been able to rediscover, Mingus spoke of the ways in which he foresaw improvised music would spread around the world and, freed from its American origins, would emerge in new forms as a result of its encounters with local musical traditions. In this, as in many other things, Mingus was absolutely right. But in saying this, we should not forget, as he certainly didn't, the collective achievements of those mostly black American musicians who made this diaspora possible and who returned improvisation to the mainstream of Western music. These reflections lead to one final, last comment. On page 70 of his book, in my edition, Stuart refers to the thought of philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein. So I'd like to conclude by doing the same. One of the ideas for which Wittgenstein is best known is his contention that many, if not most, arguments among philosophers are little more than disputes about words. I suggest that we have another such dispute here. If Marsalis, Crouch and their associates at the Lincoln Center want to restrict the term jazz to the improvised music developed by black Americans from the 1920s, the 1960s, so be it. The rest of us in the world can find plenty of ways to describe the wonderful things that we can hear in the postmodern soundscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, John. We have some few minutes, 5 minutes for questions. I cut you off, Danish.
Yeah, well, now it seems to be, I actually, I had a comment for...
Can you speak in the microphone?
Yeah, I had a comment earlier for Stuart that it seems to be unactual now. It's not, I mean, this is much more interesting and I far from that.
You can come back later. Stuart, I think you want to comment now? Or are you beaten out?
I think one of the interesting things that has emerged about the book is the serious debate and study which people like Peter have devoted to it, sitting down and challenging this, that, and the other. But, for example, Peter said, certain aspects of culture and questions, what is culture, how do we define it, where does it come from, where does it go, etc. But essentially what I was doing is writing for a non-academic press. This is a major publisher. I only had about 250 pages, so you had to cram a lot of ideas into a short space. And if we went off flying into the distance, talking about how culture may be this or maybe that or could come from that, and you would lose the general reader, the general jazz fan. So really what I was trying to do is alert the jazz world to something that I thought was quite significant. And do it in terms which the lay reader can understand. And I think this has rather annoyed academics because they would prefer a more academic approach to this, but the whole point is that the book has provoked a kind of discussion which is ongoing, considering the book was published in 2005, and here we are talking about it now. There's certain straw men which I think you actually set up by saying, I contradicted myself by quoting jazz educators. Well, there was each chapter was a self-contained essay of reflections on the current state of things. And so I cannot see how one could do a sensible, hopefully balanced appraisal of jazz education, weighing up what is happening in the jazz education world, and flagging up a lot of concerns from not only the public, but jazz educators themselves and musicians, that the jazz education world is producing a lot of clone-like players, a lot of players who sound very much the same, and this is inevitable if you have a large number of students studying just 5 or 6 key musicians from the bop to post-bop period. It's inevitable that there will be a similarity in style and execution. I was trying to explore ways on how to get around this, and I really don't understand how you can do a chapter on jazz education without quoting jazz educators, but that's slightly baffling. But it seemed to me that you sort of undermined your argument by sort of trying to pile one thing on the other rather than just concentrating on key areas, which what we should be doing is maybe studying this aspect. Here are areas which are valid for further study, because in terms of a simple book on jazz, written for the general public, not a university press or anything like that, written in easy, accessible terms, it does give you food for thought, and I think and I hope that this is what the book has achieved. And thank you very much indeed for the attention which you've given to it. I'm very flattered.
John.
Thanks, Stuart. If I could just respond to my point, and once again, I probably didn't make myself very clear because of the constraints of time. I think the point that you make about the similarity of many players emerging from jazz courses is well taken. In fact, again, if I can think of an experience fairly recently, I was on a gig with a tenor player who was just about to leave Leeds College of Music, and he's a fantastic player, great technique. He was very concerned to make us all play really hard changes, and he had all that very well. But there was a little bit of time left at the end of the gig, and the band leader called a simple 12-bar blues in F, and that went down better than anything else the whole night, because it gave everybody a chance to relax and be themselves and be a bit different and not have to play in a certain kind of way. Now, the point I was trying to make in reference to your own text was that I think jazz educators tend, or some of them, the more thoughtful ones certainly, tend to be aware of this problem. And as we heard yesterday on many occasions,
Of course they're aware of the problem, because in the book I quote people who are aware of the problem, like Tony Whitten and people like that. Erling, for example, they're aware of this problem, and it's to those people I was looking to answers. So I'm a bit baffled, but then.
Yeah, well, again, as I said right at the start, my remarks are based on the way that your arguments have been taken rather than what you actually say. But I think that the general point about the similarity of students produced on talk courses is well taken, and I think it is an issue. It's something we want to talk about.
Thanks, Stuart.